So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder, which I think sounds really scary because the word obsessive has a really negative connotation. To me, it's more about the compulsions most of the time than it is about the obsessive parts.
So I've actually known Laura for a really long time. We met back in 2014. We had a class together in our master's program at Middle Tennessee State University. We had a lot of mutual friends in common, and so we kind of became friends through our mutual friends, and then eventually just best friends.
I was diagnosed with OCD in 2017. I had just gotten done with my master's. I was getting ready to move to Georgia to start my PhD, so I didn't get a diagnosis until I was solidly an adult. But there were definitely some signs of OCD when I was a kid. My family didn't realize that's what it was, and I didn't realize that's what it was until one of my friends who studied psychology in school, I was talking with her one day and she was like, "You know you have OCD, right?" And I had never thought about it until then. She put me in touch with her therapist and I went and got diagnosed.
Eventually, Laura got the diagnosis and learned that, hey, a lot of these kind of spirals, this kind of behavior is very normal and really not a problem when you can learn how to handle it.
For a long time, my family just thought I had anxiety, just general anxiety disorder, because I would get really concerned about if I had any cut or dry skin on my hands. I'd be really concerned if I touched a surface that maybe it had blood on it, and I would end up with some sort of bloodborne illness like HIV or hepatitis.
Specifically, I'm thinking of this one time where there was a speck of rust on a fork that had come out of the dishwasher. There was a speck of rust on a fork, and Laura had used said fork before realizing that the rust was there, and the rust kind of looked like dried blood. It was not dried blood. Why would there be dried blood on a fork? It was just a tiny little speck, but I remember at my old house in Tennessee, Laura being very concerned that she had potentially contracted AIDS. That thought had so dominated her mind that she had gone out and gotten tested several times for HIV/AIDS, and it wasn't. It was a speck of rust.
So around the time I was diagnosed, one thing that I was really struggling with was, and this was a big obsession for me for a long time, was this fear of asbestos. That was one of my big obsessions. And I remember I was talking to this friend and I was telling her that I was afraid that some linoleum flooring my parents had in their house up until I was in 4th grade. I was afraid it had asbestos backing, and that when they ripped it out when I was in 4th grade, the asbestos fibers had gotten in our house, they had gotten on me, they were somehow still on me, and I was dispersing them to the world. When I was going through that, I was going to my parents multiple times a day and just having them reiterate, when was there asbestos in our house? Having people tell me over and over that I was fine and that it was fine, and answering these questions, and they would get really frustrated. And it affected some of my relationships, because it's not fun or easy to constantly be the person who's having to reassure you. Plus, the more reassurance I got, the more anxious I would actually end up. I remember I would rub my mouth a lot, the corners of my mouth. It was almost like an anxious tic, where I would rub my mouth. I would pull the my shirt up over my mouth and rub it. I was really particular about the way cuffs on my shirt, if it was long sleeve, the way it would touch my wrists. And those, I can't remember those things well enough to really know what the compulsion was that came with those obsessions. But one thing that I remember really well, when I was younger, especially in late elementary school, I had this prayer that I would have to say perfectly, sort of start to finish, every day before I got to school. And it was really lengthy. I had to ask God for, gosh, you're making me emotional. I would have to ask God for protection and forgiveness of this really long list of people. And if I didn't do it correctly, I would have to start over. But I felt like if I didn't make it through, that those people would die during the day. And so it was it was something I would try and get done before leaving for school in the morning. And if I didn't get through it perfectly, if I didn't say everything the exact way it needed to be said, as I mentioned, I would start over, and sometimes I would still be saying it in the car on the way to school, never out loud, just in my head. And if I couldn't get through it, I would be sitting at school through the first bit of my day, just trying to get through that prayer. Because in my mind, if I didn't, something really bad was going to happen to all those people. It was something bad was going to happen to my family and to my friends. And in my OCD brain, it was all dependent on me saying that prayer. And that was really tough. I did that for years and years. And I didn't think anything of it for a long time. And now looking back on it, like, it's just textbook OCD. I think I was still a little bit, not in denial, but despite having my friend telling me that she thought I had OCD, I still wasn't very sure of it. So I went to my first therapy session. The therapist had me walk through the things that I was anxious about. And by the end of that session, she confirmed, yeah, this is definitely OCD. And that was actually a huge relief to walk out and have a diagnosis and to see like, oh, so all of this concern, all of this anxiety that I've always had, this really specific anxiety, it's not normal. It's not just something that I have to deal with. So it was nice to have that confirmation, to have that diagnosis, and then to be able to get a plan for what to do. So my first therapist wasn't excellent at treating my OCD. I didn't see her for very long because I moved. She would always encourage me to talk about what was bothering me and to talk about what I was anxious about. And it wasn't until after I stopped seeing her that I learned that is not what you want to do with OCD. The more you talk about your obsessions, the more you talk about your concerns, the more real they become in your mind, the more your brain says, oh, we're talking about this, we should latch onto it. It must be legitimate. So it wasn't until I went to see an OCD specialist in Athens when I moved to Georgia that I got more techniques on how to deal with things on my own. I've also noticed that the higher my stress level is in general, the more prone I am to experiencing OCD symptoms. If COVID had happened just a few years sooner, I don't know what I would have done. My OCD really, I guess you could say, went into remission or started to get really under control in late 2018, early 2019. And so if COVID had happened even a year earlier, it would have been a lot harder for me. People will say that the enemy of OCD is uncertainty. So you are kind of constantly just saying, what if? And that's what it was like during COVID, where we said, oh, masks, you don't need masks. No, you definitely need masks. So there was a lot of uncertainty there. And I feel so incredibly lucky that I had my Lexapro, I had my strategies from therapy, and I could really deal with those things, or it could have been a lot worse. So in early 2020, right before the pandemic, I was feeling really good, and I said, I'm gonna get a tattoo that sort of represents my OCD journey. And so I ended up getting just a little square, and it represents square breathing, which is one of the first therapy techniques that I learned that was really helpful. And you picture a square, and you do 2 breaths in across the bottom, and then 2 breaths out across the side, 2 in across the top, 2 out across the other side. And you do that as much as you need to just ground yourself, to just sort of come back to reality.
She's in a really good place now, and I mean, I am incredibly happy and proud and view it as a success story.
My OCD at this point in my life is actually really well under control. So I've gone through cognitive behavioral therapy for it, and I also take medication. I feel pretty good most days, but my biggest obsession has always been and will always be contamination. And so sometimes as a professor, being around a lot of people, being around people who might be sick, being around people who are touching a lot of surfaces, that can be a little bit stressful, but there are definitely kind of little daily triggers of just, oh, who else has touched that doorknob? That student who was coughing, what did they have? Was it COVID? So that's something that I think I'll always kind of deal with and struggle with.